And welcome back. We are being joined virtually this morning by the Minister of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management, none other than Orlando Habet, to discuss with us a range of topics. Good morning, Minister Habet.
Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, good morning. Good morning, Belize. Happy to be here to join you this morning. It's a pleasant morning. Of course, we were talking about a little bit change in the climate, at least
Yeah.
for us. The weather has changed a little bit, and
Lovely weather.
we really need the rain, certainly.
Yes. Okay, so where I want to begin this morning is naturally where we left off yesterday and the previous day. And it has to do with this entire Port Magical proposed development near the Sibun River. One of my questions initially is to get your weigh in on the minutes of the meeting that was revealed a few days ago that took place in 2021. I know that you're not a part of the National Environmental Appraisal Committee, but you are updated every so often as to what is taking place with the decisions that NEAC makes. Let's begin there.
Okay. Well, certainly, as I mentioned in the previous interview, that the applications, especially from these large development projects, come into the Department of the Environment. As such, there is no legislation that says, well, you can't or you cannot submit an application. So the applications come in. I think mentioned previously also is that many times there are expectations from some of these developers, maybe rightly so on their behalf, maybe not so much on the government's behalf. But in any case, they submitted the applications, and then the projects that require an EIA request that these EIA documents be submitted, reviewed by the Department of Environment, and then the Department of Environment makes a submission of their report and their findings to the NEAC. And the NEAC, which is comprised of these 15 members from both the public sector, professionals, technical people, some CEOs that are also technical, representation also from the private sector and the NGO civil society. And they review the reports, and they, it's not on one or two or whatever meetings they need to finalize their assessment of that report. And then they submit a recommendation to the Department of the Environment based on their findings on whether they submit to accept and to possibly grant or not grant the ECP. But in the end, it is the Department of the Environment that has the final say on whether they accept that or not.
When we look at the particular area in question in the vicinity of Northern Lagoon, a little north is Gales Point, a little south is the Sibun River, and this is the proposed location for this development. The example that I want to draw on is a year or so ago when Vulcan Mining proposed to do some work in that area. There was all this noise being made by the government, by the environmental community, and everybody else who considers him or herself a stakeholder in that issue. And when you look at what's taking place here, everyone is relatively mute, but we're looking at an environment that, for all intents and purposes, is rather sensitive ecologically. Let's get your position on that.
I think there are two different projects. Certainly, one of the things that you also look upon is the project itself. These are two certainly different projects. One was mining a lot of the materials that were there, going into the sea, affecting the either the alkalinity or the acidity of the ocean, affecting the ecosystem. There was concern from that particular village and the people from that village in regards to defacing these hills, which for them are are something that they look upon, especially during travel from Belize City to Gales Point. And so there are different concerns. But also what you do too is you look at some of the history of these developers, and certainly that also takes something of consideration in the history, what they have done in the recent past and in maybe years past, what effects have they caused on the environment in this regard, problems that they've had with other governments where they have established themselves. So these are come to play in some of the decision making. Um, in the case of this project, certainly, as I have mentioned, all projects will have certain components that we have to address, that we have to look upon the environmental impacts, because they will all have some environmental impacts. The problem is that you have to look at whether or not these are mitigatable or not, or to what level they can be mitigated and how they can work. And
So
secondly,
let me stick up in there, Minister, if you allow me to. So
certainly.
while we ran Vulcan out of Dodge immediately for proposing to us that they would have been doing this kind of work in the vicinity of Gales Point, mining and dealing with aggregates and what have you.
Yes.
On the other hand, there's a proposal to dredge 8.5 million cubic meters of material to be able to build this port. Either way, you're looking at potentially serious environmental impact, correct?
I wouldn't be able to say personally if they are serious, but they might have some impact. They all do.
Well, it stands to reason that there's a likelihood that there will be environmental impact.
Certainly, like I mentioned, they all do. It is to have that balance between the environment, the social portion of what that project will bring and benefits, and also the economic benefits that it will bring in. So you try to have that balance and to make certain that whilst you might want that part of the economic and social part to benefit your people, you also want to see that you don't have that substantial effect on the environment and things that are not mitigatable. So I am not the technical person, but I understand from the technical people who sit on the DOE and also on the NIAC that those are the things that they look at.
So then, Minister, is that something that you guys are considering when it comes to the approval of the final project of the port, where it's which port has the least environmental impact?
Certainly, you from the standpoint of this project, I think one of the things that have come up are comparisons and different companies who might not have been approved will come up with things that they see on the other company that was approved and say, well, we are doing the same thing or we were doing nearly the same thing. How come ours wasn't approved? So it is done on an individual project basis. And so you look at the situation, the size, the impacts, whether they're the same, they're different, what kind of ecological impacts they will have on certain parts of the environment and habitat. And they are not all the same. The composition of the material, whether or not one is closer to the city, one is farther away, what is the composition of that material, how will it affect the rest of the sea and the ocean in this case, possibly drifting into the reef, which one is closer, and all these things can come into effect. And so they're looked at from that standpoint.
Going back to my initial question, though, I was asking at the beginning of the conversation whether you've had an opportunity to look at the minutes of that particular meeting from February 2021. There are a number of concerns that were raised in that particular meeting. It has to do with the environment and the fact that these members of NIAC representing fisheries and other interests were raising certain concerns regarding the sensitivity of the area in question.
Yes, and so I believe that in the final analysis and the recommendations that came from the NEAP, which all of these groups that you mentioned are part of, um, the recommendation came that you can't just give a blanketed ECP to go ahead in full unless, in this case, it was done through a phased approach. And so I think the ECP called for 5 different phases in which each phase, after completion or at least near completion, will be analyzed before approval is given for the second or the third and the fourth and the fifth phase.
Well, Minister, we were overlooking the minutes, and we wanted to get a reaction from you with certain parts of the minutes that was discussed. And I'm going to read verbatim from the actual minutes. It says, the chair tabled the question, can the project be approved in a phased approach? The representative of the Lands and Survey Department requested an extension of the time to provide for her decision. What is your reaction to that?
Well, if the ECP was granted and they needed time, I imagine that that time must have been given for them to review. If they go, remember that these representatives go there with authority. It's not the minister, it is that technical person that is there. So they go with that authority. So it doesn't make sense to send a representative who will not have that authority, because then the minister really is not the technical person. So we will look at it from the political level, possibly, but not at that technical level. The next thing is that if a representative who should be there isn't there at time, I imagine time is afforded to them to review and to pass their comments, and then a final decision is made. I believe that at that level, if that is what was requested, then there must have been that time allotted, and then there must have been a response from that technical person from that department.
So on Tuesday, a letter was sent to the Chief Environment Officer, Anthony Mai, but it was also CC'd to you as essentially his political boss, from Nextera Consulting. And this speaks to the FOIA request being made, the Freedom of Information Act request. One of the things that stood out to me from reading that letter is the fact that while environmental clearance had been given to Portico, and we're looking at a specific timeline here, a recent site visit indicated that nothing has happened since then. How do you respond to the fact that while yes, clearance was given in the first instance in 2020, I believe it is, and since then the area remains completely untouched? There is no sign of work being done or anything to that effect. What happens at that point? Does the, I'm trying to get it correct here, does the company at that point have to reapply for clearance, or how does that process work?
I think the legislation speaks to whether or not any work has been done, but it doesn't specify as to what it qualifies as work. And so when time has passed, and it has occurred in other projects, where for some reason or the other, or reasons or the other, they couldn't commence at the time frame that was allotted, they can reapply for a new ECP, and then the DOE will make an assessment of whether or not it is granted because of those circumstances that didn't allow them to proceed, and also whether or not any change has happened. If no change has occurred, then it is easier for them to grant that similar ECP. But if some substantive change has occurred, then I think that a new process has to take place. But also, if you recall, we started off mentioning that in this case, this project was given the ECP on a phased approach.
Mm-hmm.
So the first phase has to be completed or near completed before they apply for the second phase. So work does not necessarily mean physical infrastructure work, but all the preparation, studies, whatever it is that it entails.
In this case, however, if I'm not mistaken, um, part of what was agreed upon was that a fence would have been built and other specific infrastructure, maybe not necessarily the port proper, but other works were to have commenced as part of the initial project. That hasn't taken place as yet.
I won't be able to say so, and I don't agree fully with that because I think
Okay.
that studies have been done. I think a manatee management plan has been submitted. Other requests for that first phase have already been submitted, and so then I also believe there's a rapid ecological assessment that has been submitted but is
Mm-hmm.
still pending review. And when that is completed, then they will apply for the second phase where more of the physical infrastructure construction will commence. I believe, if I can recall, I'm not recalling all the phases exactly how they go, but I think the actual port construction is almost at the last, at the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's interesting that you would mention the manatee management plan because that's a sort of a important piece of this entire conversation that we're having. Have you guys been able to review that plan and grant any approval for what has been presented?
Um, the technical staff has reviewed it. I believe that my understanding is that it has been sent to the fisheries department, and their people are reviewing it, and then they will shortly meet to look at on both sides to see if it complies or not. Yeah.
Minister,
Personally, I have not looked at it, or at least reviewed it. I have only looked at the presentation of the document.
Minister Orlando, I want to ask you, what is your overall take on the definitive agreement signed with Portugal?
Well, we all know now from what has been revealed publicly that this agreement was signed by the previous administration, and uh, in what we can discern, some will say well it was illegal, some will say the minister had certain authority. It is the onerous upon this administration to look at it keenly and see where things can be changed or amended because we don't believe as a government that it can pass through the way it was signed.
Going forward, if there is to be any negotiation to look at something more amenable, both for the government of Belize and, of course, the developer, what role, if any, does the Ministry of Sustainable Development play at that point?
Um, as you know, our portfolio calls under the Department of Environment to look at that particular portion, especially on the environmental impacts and what is mitigated, what is not. Um, in terms of sustainable development, we can also have our input as to the sustainability portion of the project, but largely is going to be a cabinet decision, which will also look at, of course, the social and economic impacts and benefits, of course.
I think in the round, when we look at development and the idea of sustainable development and economic development, it's difficult at this point in time to have one without the other, but the environment plays an important role in all of it because while you're creating jobs and what have you, and you're generating revenue, the fact that you're dealing with an area that is ecologically sensitive, and I keep going back to this because at the end of the day, we're looking at various species of flora and fauna that are native to that particular area that, for all intents and purposes, can be affected adversely by what is taking place there.
Most certainly, like I mentioned, all projects, I believe even small ones have some impact, medium ones. These projects will all have their negative side. So that is what we have to look at. And as I mentioned, strike that balance. We have to recall that Belize has been preserving and conserving its natural assets for many, many years. We have done that at the sort of an opportunity cost for us, both on the terrestrial side and on the marine side. Um, we have done it at the expense and loss of development. Some of those resources we have committed to long years of conservation and maybe even more than conservation, preservation. We haven't been paid for those, and other countries have exploited their resources, and we are now paying the consequences for some of that same exploitation. So Belize has to be very, very careful, certainly, and we have to look at where we want to go in terms of development. We have a manifesto, which is the uh, Belize plan, which we need to look at carefully, and we want to fulfill our commitments under that manifesto. We also have commitments under the United Nations, which we need to fulfill. We have the 2030 agenda. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that we have to also look at for completion by 2030, where Prime Minister should be attending the midterm sort of review, the summit of the SDGs in September of this year, looking at the stock taking and where we are. And so Belize has to make certain that while we're doing our conservation, some conservation, that we look at the livelihood of our people, because our people come first. And certainly the environment plays a significant and major role there. And I think that is where we also have been able to attract certain types of tourism to the country. I think in terms of moving forward, along with the Ministry of Tourism, niche, look at some of these valuable assets that we have. What is it that we'll be able to utilize going forward, and what we won't be able to utilize, or what will be put at a tiered level where a certain level, certain tourists will be able to visit certain sites, but certain exclusive or really treasured sites will be visited by only a few who can afford it. Things like that, so that we can also have that conservation for many, many years to come and for future generations.
Minister Habet, a number of FOIA requests have been made to the government of Belize for information regarding the definitive agreement in the first instance, and of course, where we are with the ECP and the EIA for Port of Magical Belize. I understand that the government has sort of remained mute in its response to those requests. The most recent one was made 2 days ago to your ministry by extension. Are you prepared to facilitate this request and provide the information being asked for, at least from the political directorate?
Yes, certainly. There is some information that I think the Department of Environment already puts out there, is already on their site. And whenever a request comes in, we allow our team to look at that request and to see what legally is allowed to be given out there. We also have to recall that Belize recently signed the Escazú Agreement, which facilitates the sharing of certain information. And so we are there. We have the Freedom of Information Act, which allows us to divulge information. And so I believe that the department and the government will look at that closely and then certainly provide information that is needed.
Perhaps you could segue at this point to other topics while we have you here with us. Climate change, and of course, SICA just wrapped up its session here in Belize yesterday. Let's talk about the work that your ministry is doing in respect of climate change and what we can expect ahead of COP28.
Yes, certainly. Our ministry has recently sent representatives to Bonn to look at the preparations for some of these committees. looking at preparation for COP28. Um, One of the things that we are also looking closely is at how we can participate and have our inputs into the new agreement for where the UNFCCC eventually at COP27 agreed to the loss and damage fund. We want to know how we can have our inputs into how the mechanism will operate, how will those monies, if there's going to be a separate entity that will have and manage that fund instead of maybe going through Jeff or GCF, but a special organization. What will be the facility and accessibility of that fund, and what will qualify under loss and damage. For instance, can we, who are affected, the countries who are affected in the region by sargassum, can we justify submitting the effects of sargassum on our fisheries, on our coast, the effect on our tourism, because it sort of moves away our tourists when they see this large amount of sargassum on our coast. Then things like that, can we access that? Can we look at the multidimensional variability index, in that not all countries are affected equally, but some maybe in certain areas more than others? Can we put that into consideration? Um, we are doing our part in terms of mitigation. As you know, working closely with the other ministries, we're looking at the areas of health, certainly. One in particular that we are working with closely now also is in agriculture, looking at land degradation, the land use, instituting new technologies, and also changing the way we have done things in agriculture from the past, and going into sustainable and renewable agriculture and livestock production. In terms of energy, the ministry is working closely with that ministry also to look at how we can really step up the production of renewable energy. And we have seen what has happened in the last few weeks, and some of the reports that we got from BL, where we had problems with energy because there was an overconsumption due to the increase in heat in the country. And so air conditioners were being used a lot more. The supply of water at the dams was not there as needed. And then certainly the issue with CFE, we have to look at energy independence, because certainly when there's a crunch, and CFE will not leave out Cancun and Playa del Carmen
Yeah,
and
the Yucatan
Cozumel,
Peninsula. Yeah.
European Peninsula, we are going to be the ones that will be cut off first.
Hmm.
So we are working hard on that and looking at how we can look at that. And so we are preparing also, along with the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, for the preparation of the investment summit at the end of August, so that we can propose from our side some of the areas that we can see where we can have an input in greening the economy, and in terms of energy, which is so much very important, and which we have to address right now, is not only at looking at solar and wind, but where can we use maybe single turbines instead of these large turbines that are used, or the hydroelectricity. Where can we push for maybe ethanol fired plants? So we will have to maybe utilize some of the molasses that we currently produce instead of exporting it to produce energy. Or we also have a project that we are working with, where the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development are helping us to push the GCF for a project for the production of wild sugarcane for the production of ethanol. And so we are working closely with most of the ministries to see what we can do in terms of mitigation, but also adaptation. We have to look at that closely. And that is where we want at COP28 to make certain that some of the funding, or at least the funding is the way it is currently structured, to be changed from mostly going to mitigation, which we don't produce much of the emission, to go to the adaptation part, where we have to adapt and become resilient. And of course, we have to understand the financial institutions. We look at those particular projects in adaptation where you want them to be resilient, but resilient as early as possible. Because you don't want to spend, for example, millions of dollars in planting trees in an area where it is vulnerable to fires, and you planted it, and a year later, all of it is gone because a fire passed through. things like that. So they have to be something that makes sense.
Minister, with your portfolio also covering disaster risk management, what's the preparations like as it relates to the hurricane season?
Yes, certainly. The department NEMO is prepared, and I just want to mention that while many times we look at NEMO as only that office with those particular officers there heading the department, NEMO is basically the entire government. We have various committees that look uh, at relief and supplies, look at search and rescue, look at housing, look at infrastructure. And so all these committees have now met, at least for the first time, in preparation for this new hurricane season. The department is doing training continuously and with their staff, especially, and those in the districts, and also bringing in the municipalities and having that training in preparation. The public service is looking at getting the names for those public officers that will have to be called upon when a hurricane comes in and any other emergency, so that they can put in their share of work and assist. Um, we also have last year, through the auspices of UNDP and funding from international organizations, that we produced our first PDNA, which is a post-disaster needs analysis, which goes beyond the disaster analysis of just what occurred during the hurricane time, but also includes the portion of recovery, which is so very important. Because many times we get assistance and some food here, a little thing here. It's basically just for that day or days immediately after. But for the full recovery, which takes years, we normally haven't been getting that type of assistance. And if you get any kind of assistance offer, it's usually in terms of loans, and it doesn't put us anywhere because it's just getting us indebted more and more.
Minister, before we conclude our discussion with you, I just wanted to circle back to the initial conversation with respect of the Portico situation. How do you respond to the criticism being levied against your ministry and, of course, the CEO in your ministry for proceeding or allowing for the push for Portico in the face of all the concerns that are being raised environmentally and otherwise?
Listen, we got a portfolio not because of our choice, but we serve at the behest of the Prime Minister, myself included. And it is a large ministry. We have about 7 departments, 3 units, and the Department of Environment traditionally is always out on the limelight. Whether you do or you don't, you will be looked upon and dissected really keenly. And so we have to do what we have to do. We do our best. We have very good and very well trained, experienced technical officers, but it is not only the Department of Environment that is well qualified, but we have people at NEAC that have substantial areas of experience and technical knowledge. And when we look at these analyses for these projects, we also have to remember that in NEAC, whilst many times we don't mention it, but it is not only government people that are in those committees, but we have private sector, the NGOs are also in there.
All right. Well, thank you, Minister, for joining us this morning. Do you have any last words that you'd like to mention just before we wrap things up?
Well, I just want to mention that since we are now in the hurricane season, that we ask people to really be careful to have their hurricane management plans at the household level, at the company level. We are all in this together. We appreciate the assistance that we usually get from the private sector. Certainly to thank again all those who assisted us during those days immediately following Hurricane Lisa. Um, Even the cane farmers came in to assist us. I think the Mennonite community came in to put in trucks and to haul out the garbage and to help to clean up. But the residents, especially in this case from Belize City, who did their part in cleaning up the areas, taking out the garbage and everything else to be disposed of. But certainly, you have other organizations. I think even the Chamber of Commerce did their participation, the Red Cross, and everyone. So I think that we are blessed to have people who are very conscientious
Yeah,
and that do their part. And the media, certainly, because the media is there all day, all night until the end of the event.
indeed.
Um, and so we appreciate that participation. It is it is something national that affects all of us, whether or not the hurricane just hits the coast and not inland, but we will all suffer the consequences. So we all have to be part of it and work together. And I appeal to the public officers. We had some little glitches the last hurricane event where some officers did not show up to put in their pound when it was necessary, and some officers who were there had to do double or triple shift. But we hope that we can remedy that situation and that the public officers will really come in to assist this time if and in case there is one other such event.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us. We appreciate the information that you provided, and we look forward to having you again with us in the future.
Certainly, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, it's all about the U17 Central Basket Championship Belize 2023. Don't go away.